To begin with, I just want to make one clarification. Zimbabwe is not a nation. Zimbabwe is a state, in case people did not know that. Zimbabwe is a state, but it is a state. Within that state exists different nations. Ndebele is a nation, Shona is a nation. And by right, if the equation was to function properly in a proper political maturity, Zimbabwe would have managed to graduate into something that we call a nation state. Britain is a very good example of a nation state. In fact, United Kingdom is a very good example of a nation state, with the different tribes, if you like, the British, the English, the Welsh, the Scottish, the Irish, living side by side, and actually enjoying their peoplehood and contiguity, and also the essence of their identities and their history and their cultures. But unfortunately, in a case like Zimbabwe, where we have had to experience serious dehumanization, particularly in the form of Gukurahundi, which was physical violence, which is what I'm going to talk about, naturally we have lost the ability and the potential to become a nation state. So we remain actually existing as a state, not as a nation. And it's very interesting because most of you here, if I was to ask you, where are you from? Often, if you want to see it with the people from Matabeleland, one of the things that they do is that they will be at the forefront. Well, they're good at actually saying, I'm Zimbabwean. That's what they will say, I'm Zimbabwean. But then their being Zimbabwean, or their Zimbabweanness, will only end at the point of his tupa. Beyond the identity, the ID rather, the ID card, the person of it ceases to be Zimbabwean because there is nothing that then defines them as Zimbabweans. Immediately, they then fall into the different categories of the nations that they belong to, which is very interesting because social identities and cultural identities in Africa are very thick than actually identities that we should be having and enjoying with our states. Now, that said, allow me to then ask a few, or maybe to begin by also offering a few definitions. In fact, by the way, I had said when Dr. Mguni asked me to come and give a talk, I tried to toy with a lot of ideas. I'm a scholar in cultural studies and I'm a sociologist by training. So I was wondering what exactly is it that I'm going to talk about. Then around 2 a.m. this morning, an idea just crossed my mind. I said, okay, my talk is going to be about what I will refer to as of marginality, space, and the politics of difference. In essence, I'm looking at beginning with culture as first and ending with identity as reality. But let me first define what culture is. In my view, I'm taking this from some of my writings, so you will pardon me. Culture basically entails the actual grounded terrain of the practices and representations, and language is at the center of it, and also customs of many specific societies. For example, here, what we are doing here, we're trying to revive Ubuntu. That is part of what we mean. But of course, culture also is concerned with questions of shared social meaning. We must share it. Culture is actually learned. We learn it, it has two variables. We learn it, we share it. So it actually has shared social meanings and also the various ways we make sense of the world. And one of the ways that we make sense of the world is our being diasporic here. All of us, that what has brought us here today is actually the fact that we are diasporic. We are actually existing outside the space that we claim is our home. And also, another issue that's very important is that it's language that actually embalms culture. It's language that becomes the conduit to culture. Now, language gives us meaning. It helps us to define our social practices and to live within them and to understand ourselves. It helps us to define who we are. It is through language that we're able to define also what I refer to as the structures of feeling. Gukurahundi is one very good example of how, when we were dehumanized, we found a way of actually presenting our story through language. And we have been able to take our story from that particular level to a way of defining ourselves. Everyone now here from Matabeleland would actually identify with the narrative of Gukurahundi some way, one way or the other. So, culture actually in many ways, is part of this expressive totality of social relations through our expressions as part of what I have already referred to as the structures of feeling. Now, the structure of feeling about how diasporic and cultural temporalities have brought us here today. First, what does being diaspora mean? We are all diaspora here. What does being diaspora here mean? What does it mean to our identity? What does it mean also to our imagination of who we are? What does it mean to our positionality? What does it mean to our decisions or the decisions that we make as a people? These are some of the things that I want us to ask ourselves so that we understand why we are here today. And also, how does this bring, or how does our being diaspora influence the ethnic issues that my brother was talking about here? Because I don't know whether people have noticed this. There are so many people. I was an activist in Zimbabwe. I used to get arrested several times. And when I was teaching at the university, every week I had visitors in my classes from the president's office coming to hear what I was teaching. And I used to like those visitors because I would tell them everything so that they go and report. And one of the things that I discovered was that a lot of my brothers and sisters back home were not as conscious of Ubuntu Babo, they were not as conscious of Ubuntu Babo when they were there. But suddenly some of them, I meet them here, they have become extremely robust in their engagement of their identities and who they are. In terms of Ubuntu Babo, Ndebele Babo, from being from Matabeleland, and in fact being very clear that the problem in Zimbabwe are actually the Shona, which is true, of course. Now, I found it very interesting that that is happening, and I've wondered why. So it is those things that I also want us to understand, because they are part of this concept of culture that we are talking about. Now, being diaspora, one of the things that it does is, particularly for people like you and me, we exist as a diaspora within what we refer to as a form of coloniality, which results actually in what we call, I'll try to explain these concepts. This exists in results in what we call ontological exile. What I mean there is that we are all persons or people who are actually being forced to live outside of ourselves, outside the sites of our belonging, outside the sites of our identities, who we are, our cultures, our language, our history, by being here. So one becomes actually foreign to themselves if actually they are to be diaspora like where we are. We become foreign to ourselves. And what is worse with us, the people from Matabeleland, is that we are actually products of a kind of diaspora that I refer to as the diaspora of desperation. I don't know whether people have noticed this. We are actually the diaspora of desperation. And we are the diaspora of desperation, which is actually caused by our departing from Zimbabwe, which itself is a zone of dehumanization that dehumanizes us, that denies us belonging, that denies us our identities, who we are. And then we move to another zone, which actually when we come to UK, we actually come with the hope that, well, that God-forsaken place, I have left it because they killed my father, so I'm here, at least I'm hoping to find something. And then within a short space of time, when you arrive, you are welcomed, you are at home. After a period of time, everyone gets tired of you, who's away like you? And then suddenly you are going through another process again, which is what I refer to as another zone of dehumanization again. Because suddenly you are being reminded that, look, while you are here, we are at home, but you are not quite at home here. And I always argue that then because of that, it is only when you are at that level of these two zones of dehumanization that you suddenly discover who you are and where you are supposed to be. That is where culture comes in. That is where culture then immediately comes to grip with us and links with our identities. Now let me go back to also look at the zone of dehumanization, which is the first one, Kukurahundi, so that we understand it. To me, it is the source. We all remember Kukurahundi, its physical nature, that is the naked violence that it actually was meted on, was meted on our people. If you remember, all of us here, I'm sure we will agree, Kukurahundi is a genocide, so we do not have to debate that. But then we remember the end of the physical violence of Kukurahundi. The physical violence of Kukurahundi itself, one of the things that it had done on us was to create serious scars of dehumanization, serious scars of failing to understand even who we are. It is one that caused our people to immediately change their sense of identity and find themselves having to identify with other people, those that actually had dehumanized them, which I'm going to talk about later on. Now, we see the end of the physical violence of genocide, but then I also want to argue that Kukurahundi genocide did not end there. It did not only end with the physical violence. What we then witness is the genocide is what I call the genocide of cultural structures. This one is characterized by the denial of access to resources. It is also characterized by the denial of life-changing opportunities and the continuous process of dehumanization and rejection that we face in Zimbabwe. That constantly in Zimbabwe you are made to know that you are actually a second-class citizen, that you actually do not belong, and constantly from time to time if you vie for an office that people from Mashonaland want, they will tell you whatever they say, meaning South Africa. Now, so what does this kind of genocide do to us? Because as my brother said, a culture develops. So what does this kind of genocide lead us to? It leads to what I refer to as the process of depersonalization of specific members of societies, of a society that are targeted in development. And also, it also leads us to a form of social death, which people do not realize. Do you know that a person can actually be walking, living among us, alive there with us, but socially dead? And our people, the story of the people of Matabeleland is a very painful story. It is the story of a people who actually have been forced to subsist. This is the story of a people who have been forced to cease to live but to exist. And what brings us here today is our quest not only for existing about. One of the things that it does, apart from leading us to social death, the result of it is what I call cultural dismembering and identity dismembering, which emerges, which we see with our people failing to clearly define who they are. And often, our people cannot then identify with in their own language. I would have preferred to speak in Ngesindebele, but because we have your worship here and some of our visitors here, I thought it would be good that I engage you all in English. But I'm hoping that people will understand. What I'm arguing here is that then, one then begins to exist in that space, I call it the liminal space, where identity and belonging exists at the level of just a fuss. You are no longer Ndebele, you are in diaspora, you no longer don't know really who you are. This is what has brought us here today, to try and revive Ubuntu Betu. Now, some of our brothers, and you can put yourselves in different spaces. I'm not going to put people in those spaces, but people will imagine where they are. But some of our brothers and sisters have remained in that liminal space. And most of them are consumed by the desire to emulate the life of their oppressor. And I must actually, by the way, I'm one of the people who's very direct about these things, and I've written about it without shame. Our oppressors actually in Zimbabwe are the Shona, and you'll be lying if you say they are not. Our people exist in that liminal space where they actually attempt to emulate their oppressors. And so they look at the oppressors, and even the children of the oppressors, with envy. But it only ends at the point of salivation. You can't go beyond. You only salivate and it ends there. A very good example I will give. I was doing research at one point, one of the pubs, Utoksemadlozo. I don't know whether people still remember that. The pub, Utoksemadlozo. I was doing research there. I met some, I was doing focus group discussions. I met some people from Emanda, Abadala, and one of them was sharing his experiences with us. In fact, he had one too many, so he had the courage to say a few things. So he had one too many and he was sharing his experiences. He says to me, you know, my manager just came from Haran. He doesn't know anything. I'm the one who's teaching him. And I'm so proud, you know, I'm doing a good job. I'm teaching this guy. And you know, he also bought my son a bicycle. I'm so happy. This guy is a very good manager. You know, that is what I call the point of depersonalization, the point of ceasing to live but to begin to exist. That person does not understand that even the manager who actually is referring to as Shona, by right he should have actually chased him from that office that he's finding himself in. But what does that mean? It is that point that I was talking about that we are in as a people. So how do we define our gathering here? I will define our gathering here by referring to what is happening here today has a history. Other people have done it before. Dr. Nguni and Dr. Matewele, I'm sure you would remember, there is something that is called negritude, which was started some years in the 1920s. The 1920s, stretching to the 1960s, it became a movement, sort of. It was like Back to Africa movement with scholars like M. Cicere and scholars like Leopold Sedar Senghor, the first president of Senegal, and others. They were the ones who actually started talking about Back to Africa movement, black consciousness, and issues of history. Being reminded that much as we are British, we actually do not really quite fulfill the space of actually being British. Now, this is also because I argue the ceiling of racism is very low, even for a short person. Quickly you hit it with your head, and suddenly you get a knee-jerk reaction that you don't belong here. Now look back home. Now, it's easy to hit that ceiling. Now, the moment you hit that ceiling, the stark reminder that has brought us here, that we are actually diasporic, we are diaspora, also is one way we can explain these kinds of the gestures we're doing, our gathering today, and even the radical perspectives we get from some of our brothers saying we want secession, we want to break away from the state of Zimbabwe. All that actually helps us to understand our situation. But what does it mean? It is an attempt aimed at moving away from our being culturally dismembered. What we are doing today is an attempt to regroup, to move away from being culturally dismembered to a point of actually being culturally remembered and a form of cultural remembrance. Now that explains the reason why my brother here was talking about Ubuntu Betu and how and why it is so important that as a people from Matabeleland, we actually have to identify and one other thing that also is coming, I think it's another factor that we should consider as one that helps in, you know, grouping people at a cultural level like we are doing today in terms of reviving our culture. It is that the more we globalize, the more we localize. An example of that is what we are seeing here in the UK. We are existing, or we're living at a time, very interesting times here in the UK, the times of Brexit, as a result of the right-wing politics which has allowed us to finally realize Brexit. But like one of my colleagues, a scholar by the name of Achille Mbembe, he actually says, Brexit actually is causing us to realize that Europe is closing itself to humanity. And as a result, we are all gathered here because we have somehow realized that, you know, there is the need for us to take advantage of that. And that it's time for us to reconnect with our roots, with our identities, galvanize our culture. This is basically what has brought us here. However, as we do this, we have one barrier as well, which is waiting for us there. It is the barrier called Zimbabwe. Why do I call it a barrier called Zimbabwe? I call it a barrier because being Ndebele in Zimbabwe and being Ndebele even outside Zimbabwe, one suffers actually from what I call the double diaspora. I'm sure all of you have suffered that, and I'm going to explain this. Now, this is a result of being in that space in Zimbabwe where you are not accepted, and often in Zimbabwe, to show that we are actually part of the diaspora, we even live in a kind of, constructed diaspora. Even the music in Zimbabwe that we will associate with Tina is music South Africa, which actually is music that's not actually produced by, most cases, by locally within Wabulawayo, including lots of other cultures that are actually, as it were, associated with Egoli. So that's part of the diaspora. And then we are here again, it is another kind of diaspora. So what we see here, in my argument, is that we are seeing a kind of social reality of Africa, and also another problem of social identities in Africa that I earlier on alluded to, that our social identities and our social realities are that we prefer to identify with our own first, our identities of Ubuntu Betu, before we even seek to identify with what one would refer to as belonging to a state, Zimbabwe. Now, what does that actually entail? Being here today means that we are reviving, not our culture, because we already have a culture, as my brother said. We are reviving the essence of our humanity because we have been products of serious dehumanization, Kukuraundi being one of them, and many other systems and structures that have been put in place to actually dehumanize us. Our meeting, our gathering here today is designed to help us to recoup the long lost glory of our people, of our identity, who we are. How then we will then take it further into the future remains to be seen. Dr. Mguni, when you asked me to come and give a talk about this, one of the things that I found very interesting is that I have been talking to a couple of friends, is that while we are attempting to define the essence of our people have since lost the sense of their history. Our people have since lost their identities. And at the core of their identities, our people have since lost their language. And to show that our people have lost their languages, our people here are bearing children, and they're giving their children English names. They're giving their children foreign names. People can only identify and revive their identities if they can only, and their cultural exuberance can immediately emerge, if only they can acknowledge that isitho sabadala lesiyana esithi zibanjwa zisesemaphupho can actually be revived and brought back into our lives in such a way that the day we begin to define who we are, we do it through these young people, abantwana. And we do so by speaking to them in our languages. We do so by making them identify who they are in terms of their languages, in terms of their identities that define them as abantu bemathebelele. But if we don't do that, that actually destroys our people. And to end my talk, I'm going to leave a lot of things so that during question and answer time, I'm going to allow for people to engage me in detail. But one of the things that also has destroyed our humanity, or has destroyed our people, is that when Kukuraundi was then meted on our people, we were caused, Dr. Mguni, to lose not only hope in life, but to lose hope in ourselves as human beings, and to depersonalize and to lose a sense of being. When you lose a sense of being, you have no reason why actually you should, as a people, continue to grow. One of the things that's killing our culture, one of the things that's killing our Ubuntu, our culture, our identity and belonging, is that we now have marriages and families that only produce one or two.
Ngento zimthwala. Lapho uzathi indoda ngani ukuhambela phandle ngento lezi. Akungincedela ukuthi ngijoina ama groups angangincedisa entweni. Wathi ngiza kufaka kumthwakazi. Overnight ngazi